Today on the PIO podcast, we'd like to welcome Jeff Wenninger. He's retired from LAPD and the CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants. Welcome to the show,
Thank you for having me.
Jeff. So, can you tell our listeners about your background and how you created Law Enforcement Consultants?
Well, certainly. It's really important, I think, that people understand my personal background, my professional experiences, to understand what I'm doing today. I have a unique personal background wherein I was adopted. I was born to a teenage mother, and I was adopted into a family where my father was a sociologist and my mother was a chemist. And they wanted 4 children back to back. So they went ahead and continued to adopt. And I have a Japanese brother and I have a foster African-American sister. So I was raised in the 60s and 70s in Kent, Ohio, with a very unique, diverse family environment. And that gave me an interesting perspective that I took into my law enforcement career.
Excellent. So you retired from LAPD, and then you created your own consulting firm. What's the major part of that consulting firm? What are you doing with that firm?
Well, throughout my law enforcement career, I became quite frustrated with the insular culture associated with law enforcement and its inability to evolve as societal expectations changed. Due to some of my experiences working with the LAPD, primarily while they were under a 10-year consent decree, I focus on best practices for police management to encourage better outcomes, primarily in incidents of critical incidents where officers find themselves under extreme stress and life and death scenarios.
I will say this, having worked in a multitude of departments in my career and growing up and living in the Metro Chicago area for a good portion of my life, the stress that law enforcement officers are under nowadays has gotten so worse. And you look at how management, particularly even middle management, handles that stress that those officers are under is really, it's unacceptable. And you have all these great schools that they send them to. In Chicago, we have the School of Police Staff and Command. You have the National Academy. You have all the other schools that are out there that they send executives and leadership to, and yet they still behave as supervisors the way that they've always done. And I think that does a great disservice to our officers.
Well, I believe that the one thing that law enforcement is facing as its major challenge is its culture that's been able to persist over time. Unfortunately, the training that officers receive and the policies and procedures don't necessarily align with the culture of the law enforcement agency. And that's why we see incidents where officers are getting themselves into trouble because there's mixed messages. And yes, I would agree with you. That's a result of the poor leadership at the highest levels of the police organizations.
Absolutely. And if I go back to the incident in New York where I think it was a Garner incident where they were dealing with problems, people selling single cigarettes near bodegas in New York City. And the law enforcement supervisor for that agency said, go and take care of it. I don't want to hear any more about it. Go take care of it. Well, they didn't give them any other guidance in it. And what did they do? They went and took care of it. And as a result, that led to the death of somebody and the potential prosecution and lawsuits and all that other stuff that came out of that incident because law enforcement leadership did not provide any kind of guidance or direction other than going, take care of it.
Well, you can't just necessarily let officers off the hook.
No, not at all. Not at all. I agree. They have responsibility.
Right. The most important tool that a law enforcement officer will have is the gray matter between the ears. And to be honest with you, I do a lot of expert testimony in use of force cases in civil and criminal cases. And I'm really shocked with the number of officers that are being sued due to excessive use of force incidents. And the case is lost primarily in the deposition because the officers are incapable of articulating the justification for their decisions and application of force. And that lies with the officers. Unfortunately, law enforcement is in the practice of training its personnel to check the box to show that we did the due diligence to train them. But are they actually competent? Do they actually understand the laws that guide and direct the actions in which they should take in the field? And are they proficient in pugilistics, in grappling, in their firearms? It's not just about punching paper on the range. It's about being proficient with your firearm where you can win a gun battle. And unfortunately, law enforcement does not tend to require that its officers are competent.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up. You know, the requirement that you have to hit the range once a month or every 6 months, and you have to put, I don't know, whatever the state requirement is, 70% down in the target in the particular format of the shooting or the targeting that you have to do, whatever that might be. They don't ever put, a lot of agencies still don't put the officers in high stress situations where they have to apply what they've learned and the ability to determine sight picture and determine, can I legally fire at this point and should I legally fire at this point. A lot of agencies still are not putting their officers in those high stress situations in a controlled environment.
Right. Well, what really reduces the stress under any circumstance is actually the understanding of the law. And Graham versus Connor is the standard in which all officers' use of force will be adjudicated and viewed through. That's the lens that it'll be viewed through. And by and large, many officers couldn't even tell you what Graham versus Connor is and explain what the criteria that is going to be used to evaluate the appropriateness of an application of force. Most significantly, the lethal force.
Exactly. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And there's been some studies done recently that show that education significantly impacts judgment and decision making relative to force, most specifically lethal force. So the studies found that officers with 4-year degrees or higher had lower incidence of force, and primarily lethal force, wherein they had the same number of interactions, same number of searches of suspects, but their decision relative to force was much different. And that's something we need to look at. If you look at, you have to look outside the United States and also North America. You look over in Europe, how they train and hire police officers. Over there, well, they go through 3 and 4 years worth of training before they even hit the streets, which is equivalent to a 4-year degree. And what do we do here? By and large, I think it's 840 hours we require for the basic academy to be a
That's even less in certain jurisdictions.
yeah, and then to be a cosmetologist, you need 1,500 hours to even apply for your license. So I mean, what does that tell you?
I agree 100% with this, Jeff. You know, in looking like in Germany, we had in my old department, we had a German officer come in as an exchange with us for a period of time. And he started his law enforcement career out in their high school level. That's where they started at high school, going through the training that they needed to do. And then into their, I think his second year in college was when he finally was able to go out into the field as a law enforcement officer. So he did almost 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different. It's very different. You look at the Scandinavian countries, and law enforcement is looked favorably by the
And,
citizens.
and I'm sure there's a lot less use of force. The other thing I wanted to bring up before is you brought up Graham versus Connor. Most law enforcement officers, unless their agencies have sent them to law updates later on throughout their career, Graham versus Connor was talked about in the academy, and that's about it.
Well, you find that to be the case with everything. I mean, look at even physical conditioning. To get hired, you have to be able to demonstrate a certain level of physical conditioning and then get to graduate from the academy. But by and large, most agencies do not hold anybody beyond graduation from the academy accountable to their physical conditioning. And that's a problem.
Yep, I agree. So, Jeff, I wanted to switch gears here. You had talked about that you deal with crisis management for leadership, and going back and kind of bringing this to public information officers. Law enforcement leaders, how do they effectively manage and support their public information officers in the sense of crisis communications?
Well, I think first that law enforcement leadership has to accurately define the mission and the purpose of public information officers. And my definition would be that they're there to enhance the effectiveness and the integrity of the law enforcement agency through consulting and promoting dialogue with the community in which they serve. And unfortunately, we see all too often that that's not the case. Law enforcement tends to do one of two things. They take a position that is politically expedient to them, or they take a position that protects the organization. And all too often, time and time again, you see these incidents where information is being provided that is absolutely not accurate. And I can give you examples of what I'm talking about. Like in
Go ahead.
Philadelphia, there was an officer involved shooting of an individual. He drove the wrong way down a one-way street, and he parked his vehicle. The officers went. The department's narrative was that the officers went to do traffic enforcement. The officer ran up, drew his gun, ran up to the driver's side of the vehicle, and within seconds ends up firing 6 rounds, killing the suspect. And the information that was provided to the public was that the suspect had exited the vehicle armed with a knife and lunged at the officer. Well, the video came out, the security video. He never opened the door. The window was rolled up. And what was provided to the public that would justify the shooting was proven to absolutely not to have even occurred. How does that happen? That can't happen. How can you blame anybody to not trust law enforcement in that type of a circumstance? And all too often you see that type of information that's inaccurate, that's provided to try to provide justification for actions that the law enforcement agency just can't stand by.
And that goes to the leadership not willing to step up and simply say, we got it wrong and we need to make some changes. If they had a bad shoot, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely wasn't justified. But what makes it even worse? What do they always say? Sometimes it's not the deeds that's not that bad; it's the cover up.
The cover up, right?
See that time and time again. Here, I'm living in Ohio now that I'm retired, and there was a shooting here of Takia Young, who stole a bottle of liquor from a Kroger's grocery store. And when the chief of police provided the information to the public through a press conference, couldn't have been further from the truth. There's all kinds of inconsistencies, and then also mentioning things relative to the individual, the suspect or the victim, however you want to look at it here, character relative to things that had absolutely nothing to do with the decision that the officer made to use lethal force. So you have to be careful, so very careful in how you are being perceived by the public, because they're watching in this day and age. And with technology, they are going to have all kinds of means to be able to call you to the carpet relative to your truth and truthfulness in regards to the version of the story that you're providing.
I can't agree more. I always come back to this incident that we had here in Chicago that made national news. It was the Laquan McDonald shooting, and that particular shooting the video was held back by the mayor's office at the time prior to re-election, and the goal was to keep it down and hide it, because the original thing was he was waving a knife and refused to drop the knife and threatened the officers with it. Well, they didn't have video at the time, or they had video. They didn't release the video. And a independent reporter here fought to get that released. And finally the release came out of that video, and the world got to see, how messed up that scene was. And it became, that was just a tragic mishap of supervision, of law enforcement training, of failure to control the scene. And I go back to leadership in that sense, and then you have, of course, the political leadership that jumps in, that fights tooth and nail to keep the video from coming out.
Right. Well, leadership really, it's derived from the quality of the personnel that you have in the organization. And if you're hiring many organizations to keep up with the demands in numbers of sworn personnel, they've they've lowered standards where they're hiring people. The LAPD hires people with a GED, equivalent of a GED. And
Oh, yeah.
is that person that we want to have making the life and death decisions and judgment calls while out confronting members of society? It's just not a good solution.
And then you go back to the inability of agencies just to hire justified qualified candidates. That makes it even harder.
Right. I mean, when we talked about the Scandinavian countries where they require officers to have the equivalent of a 4-year degree, I mean, that gives you time to evaluate and assess the personnel that are going through the process to perhaps have a career in law enforcement. You want them to have mental, emotional intelligence. You want them to have empathy and moral reasoning and those sorts of things. What the duration of this training and education provides you is an opportunity to determine, do these individuals possess these characteristics that by and large will determine whether they're going to be successful in law enforcement and be a police officer that is consistent with the expectations that society has in this day and age.
So Jeff, your suggestion then would be to go through a complete overhaul of how we train and hire officers and kind of make it part of a course curriculum that lasts 4 years minimum, and get them so this way you can evaluate them and incentivize them to going into the field.
Yeah, I mean, it helps with a broadening understanding of the social issues that you're going to have to be dealing with out there. And I did 33 years in law enforcement, and I started out with the LA County Sheriff's as a deputy sheriff for 3 years, and then I did just over 30 years with the LAPD. And I saw some horrific things, and it requires you to have an open, objective mind, wherein you're open to creative encounters, which is a diversity of thought, and be accepting of challenges. Because I've always said this, it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And getting it right requires that you have as many people sitting at the table as possible. And if you're not open to that, if you don't have that type of a mindset, then you're going to be less likely to be successful and less likely to make better decisions under stress.
Jeff, how can police leadership foster a culture of transparency and accountability within their department?
Well, I believe it has to start with having everything aligned. You have to have your training, your policies, procedures, and protocols, as well as the culture all align. And I'll give you an example of where it failed. Just a couple days ago, I believe it was on Friday, in Canton, Ohio, there were 2 officers that were indicted for negligent homicide. They had a application of force on an individual, then they handcuffed him and left him laying handcuffed in a prone position where he was stating he could not breathe. They did not respond to that. They did not comply with the policy and procedure where you have to sit them upright or put them on the left lateral as soon as practicable. And what happened? The individual died. Now you have 2 officers that, because of their inaction, which I would argue is a result of the police culture, wherein they ignored their training in the policy that requires them to do what they're required to do. It's part of this knowing doing gap. You know what you're supposed to do, but the culture gives you, in your mind, a justification to not do it. These are the outcomes that are tragic, not only for the person that's the decedent, but also the officers involved, the officer's family, and law enforcement in general.
And let's face it, there's not an officer that I know in this day and age that has not been through some training course, whether at the academy or not, that says once you've got somebody restrained and handcuffed, you sit them up or you turn them on their side and you make sure that they can breathe. I mean, this goes back to the humanity of a person too. Where's their humanity?
It does. But by and large, I'm not asserting that anybody gets into the police academy with bad intentions. It's over time that, based on what they're exposed to and the insular nature of the culture of law enforcement, of this them versus us mentality, and that bad things happen to people that make bad decisions, that type of a rationale in the justification for not doing things as they were required in this instance that we're talking about, um, that's what how things end up tragically.
Yeah, and that goes again back, as you said before, to the leadership that creates a culture that allows that stuff to go on. Jeff, what do you have any examples of successful partnerships between law enforcement agencies and community organizations that have facilitated a strong bond in your background?
Yes, absolutely. Back when I was a police officer, I had an ATM machine that when I went and talked to the uh, the people that kept the crime trends, are saying you're getting hit hard. And I looked at the analysis of the crime trends there, and by and large, the ATM was being hit at nighttime hours. So I drove out there and took a look at it. It was on Wilshire Boulevard in mid city Los Angeles, and the ATM was set back in this courtyard that had this large planter in the middle of it and was lined by a bunch of trees. So if you were standing out at the street, you couldn't even see somebody at the ATM. Beautiful place for somebody that has a bad intent to commit a crime. And there is one thing that I learned when I was a deputy sheriff working in the jails. That is a place where criminals hone their skills and their knowledge of where's good place to commit robberies. And so it was getting hit hard. So rather than do stakeouts and make some arrests, I met with the ATM bank, the responsible for that ATM was a Bank of America, and negotiated that they would close down the ATM between certain hours, and those were the hours that was getting hit the hardest. And as a result of that, there was a reduction of over 68% of robberies. And where the information, the police information officer came into play was getting that information out, wherein leaders within the city became aware of this, and other banks and ATMs were influenced to follow in the same mode and close down those ATMs, while at the same time promoting that we have ATMs in the lobbies of our police stations. And without taking on an expensive operation where you do stakeouts and all that, we were able to reduce the robberies at the ATMs citywide by 70%.
And you know what? You could have done all those stakeouts and made one or two arrests or three or four arrests, and it would have just come back after you walked away from the stakeouts.
That's right.
So,
Because the
so
environment
what?
is the same. There's
Right.
a
So what you did was far more effective.
Right. There's always another bad actor to take the place of the one that you've taken into custody. And it's about then not only doing it, but getting that information out to strategically get it out to the people that need to know, the other banks, the city leaders, those that can influence the decisions on whether those ATMs remain open during nighttime hours or not.
Jeff, how can police leadership leverage technology and digital platforms to enhance their reach to the public?
Well, there's it's very helpful to be able to use it this day and age of technology where you can do analytics. You can determine whether your messaging is actually effective in regards to how the communities and specific communities are perceiving the law enforcement agency. It also can provide like geolocation strategies where you have specific type of messaging that is unique to a particular neighborhood or group of people. So you're able better to determine that you're reaching the people that you actually need to reach. And because right now, about the data says about 62% of adults primarily rely on social media for their news. And this day and age, people have the expectation that they're able to obtain information at a stroke of a key on their computer. And it's so then therefore that much more important that the messaging and the narrative that law enforcement is providing to the community is being received and is providing law enforcement an opportunity to be viewed as in a favorable manner versus being the enemy. And the challenge to that is the resource allocation. One, it's not cheap, and two, it requires personnel. And not all law enforcement agencies have those types of resources. But um, it's technology. It not only provides challenges and obstacles, but it provides unbelievable opportunities.
I agree with you. Jeff, how can leadership ensure that the messages conveyed to the PIOs are consistent with the department's overall mission and its values?
This is the one thing that I've always said. Law enforcement should stick to what law enforcement does well, and that is not necessarily media relations. And I say that because of what I've been talking about, the culture, the insular culture associated with law enforcement. Law enforcement is not best postured to make the best decisions on what information should be released and what information should not be released. One thing that is important is that there be some level of civilianization of law enforcement, wherein you hire experts in media to actually dictate to the department how to navigate critical incidents and what information should be released, and what the impact may be of information that won't be released. So we don't go through the academy and have any great level of expertise in that arena. To have a captain of police that's in charge of media relations making those decisions is less than desirable relative to what is actually available, where you can hire people with that expertise in education and practical experience to help guide and navigate the law enforcement agency through that. So I would suggest that it's not the law enforcement agency that should be actually navigating it. It's the law enforcement agency being open and objective enough to bring in outside entities that have the expertise to provide them the direction on how best to handle the release of media information.
And I think that is becoming a trend of where you're getting more civilians, more journalism savvy, PR savvy people coming into some of the larger agencies. I think the difficulty means getting it into the smaller agencies that can't afford to have that kind of, that kind of position sitting in their on their budgets.
Right. Well, actually, we look at the Butler, PA attempted assassination of
Hmm.
President Trump, and I don't think you would disagree that the release of information by the Secret Service was horrendous, and it played into the rumors and the conspiracy theorists behind all of that. And why is that? The Secret Service leaders are not well positioned to best make the decisions relative to the release of information. And I would suggest that it's not only the Secret Service, but it's all law enforcement. Allow the heads of law enforcement to do what they do best, which is run and lead their organizations, and leave the media part to another entity. And then I would suggest the federal government start a new agency that handles all of that for not only the Secret Service, but the FBI or any major entity when it comes to a critical incident, and they would manage the media release of information. And you could do that at the state level. Law enforcement agencies get their powers by the state. Each state should have a vested interest in providing the law enforcement agencies with the expertise to best handle those critical incidents, because it's not always what happens in the critical incident that's so bad. It's the poor management of the post-critical incident handling of the information that's released that causes people to distrust law enforcement even further and create further divides between the police department and the citizens that they serve.
Jeff, you said that you deal with a lot of expert testimony and so on. One of the things that is a trend in law enforcement that I've been seeing in the last maybe 3-4 years is putting out the after incident video, the breakdown of the body camera video, showing the incident as it unfolds, and then going to that point of where the shooting occurs, and then slightly beyond. What are your thoughts about those videos being put out within a relatively short period of time? CPD used to put them out, in about 5 months, and now they're down to a relatively short time frame. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's good because it exists and the public knows that it exists and they want to be able to see it. Now, with that requires an understanding that the video is just a piece of it. It's not the totality of the information that is going to be obtained during the investigation. Listen, I was the officer in charge of detective entity that investigated all officer-involved shootings and lethal force incidents for the LAPD. I've handled probably over 700 cases, and I'm all too familiar with. You have to look at the global picture, which is all the evidence, to actually formulate a credible opinion on what actually occurred. What does the preponderance of the evidence suggest actually occurred? So the video is just a piece of that. So everybody has to understand that. But the one mistake that I see that law enforcement often makes is, yes, you have to make reference so people can have context to what they're seeing, perhaps if they don't understand specifics about law enforcement. However, all too often, there's things that are included that should be left to the individual observer to formulate their opinion, because it's almost perceived as an attempt to manipulate the perception of the video that's being watched, and that, I think, erodes the trust that the public has of law enforcement agencies when they release those videos.
Okay. Jeff, is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
Question you should ask, and how would I answer it? You know, I think it's important that people understand why I'm critical of law enforcement to the extent that I am. During my 33-year law enforcement career, I saw quite a bit. I was brought into Rampart as the officer in charge of the Rampart gang unit following the Rampart gang crash corruption scandal, the Rafael Perez scandal. I worked in that organization during the 10-year consent decree. The corruption that brought the necessity for that consent decree. You're talking about officers stealing cocaine out of police evidence lockups, selling it on the street, committing bank robberies, planting guns on suspects after officer involved shootings, the highest level of police corruption. So I was exposed to all of that. One would argue that you're not loyal to law enforcement because you're so critical. I would suggest otherwise. I am very loyal to law enforcement. I want law enforcement to be successful. And I have a forthcoming book that's coming out in March. It's called On Thin Ice. And it's a memoir, but it's also a prescriptive nonfiction relative to what I believe are some of the things that law enforcement needs to implement in order to be successful moving forward in the 21st century. But it's all because of my love of law enforcement and my desire for it to be successful. You have to be honest, and you have to be willing to accept the criticism before you can make the steps forward in making the improvements necessary.
I like that, Jeff. So what's the name of the book again that's going to be coming out in March?
On Thin Ice.
On Thin Ice. Okay, we'll have to make sure I promote that when that comes out. That's awesome. Jeff, let's do some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Texting or talking?
Talking.
Movies or books?
Books.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
Coffee.
Adult drink of choice?
Beer.
What would be your superpower if you could have one?
Wisdom.
Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Beg for forgiveness.
What place would you most like to travel to?
South America.
What's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
Talking with my son.
Who would you choose if you could have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead?
Wow, that's a good one. Wayne Gretzky. I was a Division I collegiate hockey player, and I've always been amazed by his success.
The great one, absolutely. What key points would you like our listeners to take from today's interview?
That it's important to have the courage, the passion, and the commitment to challenge the status quo, and always be open to people that have opposing opinions, because it's It's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And that requires that as many people as possible have a seat at the table and can be heard.
I like that. As we wrap up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
You know, it's always important to strive to be the best version of yourself, regardless of where you are in your career or in your retirement. But if you strive for excellence in yourself, then everything else around you will increase in elevation and will rub off on those people that you have exposure to.
Excellent. Jeff, if somebody wants to connect with you or follow up with anything they've heard today, or maybe there's somebody out there that wants to hire you from your firm, how do they get a hold of you?
The best way is to find me on LinkedIn. It's just Jeff Wenninger on LinkedIn. If you message me, I get multiple messages a day and I respond to everybody.
And I will add all of that into the show notes. Jeff, thank you very much for being on the show.